Okay, we might get started then. Hello, everyone. My name is Sandra Alde. I'm from the Sydney Southeast Asia Center, and we're so delighted and we're so pleased to have you with us today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Gadigal, Gamigal, and Bijigal peoples on whose lands I'm zooming from to you today. And I acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. The Bijigal, Gadigal, and Gamigal peoples have been the longest surviving culture in the world. And for 40,000 years, they have learned on these lands, they have discovered on these lands. And it's in this spirit of learning and discovery that we gather here virtually today. I'm very pleased to have with us an amazing academic and scholar who's going to share with us really, I'm so excited, really interesting stories about human geography. So we've got Andre Ortega, Associate Professor Andre Ortega. He's a human geographer and critical demographer, passionate about social justice. His interests lie at the intersection of urban, population, and community geographies. And in particular, he's interested in the spatial politics of urbanization in the cities of the global South. Over the past few years, he has focused on urban transformations in the Philippines, contributing to theory of new urban forms in the global South, transnational urbanisms, and geographies of dispossession. I can't tell you how excited I am, Andre, to hear you today. Welcome, and I'm going to mute myself now so that you can begin your what I'm sure will be a really interesting talk. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for that introduction. Thank you very much to everyone who's tuning in. Maraming salamat po. So let me start by providing a brief background on my research. So in the Philippines, several island communities have been transformed into world-class tourism hubs over the last few decades. Formerly reliant on fishing, many of these islands are now teeming with resorts, restaurants, internet cafes, and other enterprises that cater to foreign tourists. As an urban geographer, I consider islands to be terrains long neglected by urban theory. I argue that much can be learned from this transnationally oriented form of urbanization, where change is not due to metropolitan expansion or industrialization or spurred by state-led development programs. Instead, in these islands, development relies on tourism, which facilitates a cumulative causation of economic activities, demographic change, and transnational connections. Closer examination suggests that at the heart of these urban transformations are intimate geographies of gendered bodies and interracial marriages, serving as key modes of urban accumulation and transnational mobilities. As we all know, many of our islands in the Philippines are major components of the country's tourism campaigns. For this research, I am interested in the Philippines' attempt to build a silver economy grounded upon a graying population in the global north. Through the Philippine Retirement Agency, a special retirement visa has been created for foreigners who are at least 35 years old who need to only deposit a certain amount of money. I'm definitely part of it, but I'm not a foreigner yet. So anyway, so one of the multiple discourses from which this retirement visa campaign is built upon is a problematic narrative that historically promotes the submissive Filipina to foreigners, oftentimes perceived to be Caucasian men from the global north. Across blog sites, dating websites, and message boards for expats and foreigners seeking to relocate to the Philippines, the prospect of acquiring special retirement visas are typically associated with finding, meeting, or living with their Filipino partners. So in the slide, you can see a typical disturbing image that reproduces this stereotype. Such image can be found in many blog sites and websites that try to provide support for prospective retirees and expats seeking potential partners. My concern as an urban geographer focuses on urban transformation occurring in these islands, from which these intimate transactions take place. Conceptually, I reflect on urbanization by framing these islands not just as mere biophysical entities. Instead, these islands are dynamic spaces wherein these intimate relations and gendered landscapes are reproduced as bodies, lands, and tourist establishments are transacted and built. Sorry, excuse me. Also, they are relational sites that are embedded in transnational networks of economic, cultural, and social relations. And not just with the national capital, Metro Manila, or the regional cities of Cebu, Bacolod, or Davao, but they're also intimately connected to other parts of the world. This attempt can be seen in this slide as I try to conceptualize how these islands are embedded in these multiple scales of places. So for this presentation, my aims are to first trace the transnational geographies of island urbanization through experiences of women in an attempt to foreground the role of gender and sexuality in narratives of urbanization. My claim is that interracial relationships involving Filipinas are key to understanding urban accumulation in islands which are marketed as tourist hubs. My third objective is to theorize island urbanism. By focusing on islands, I aim to continue the efforts by urban scholars in theorizing an extended urbanization that goes beyond narratives that surround cities or big megacities. And lastly, my fourth aim for this talk is to explore possible research trajectories emanating from this provisional work. Before I get into the meat of this presentation, I do want to say that this research topic emerged out of 3 previous research projects that I did, where I examined various issues of urban transformation as I interviewed expats and their Filipino partners. After which follow-up interviews were conducted, one through Zoom, and there were also visits that were conducted in some of the islands in Southern Tagalog, Visayas, and Northern Mindanao, and they were conducted through referrals with other couples. These are complemented by secondary data collection drawn from relevant government agencies and visits to expat message boards, blog sites, and dating sites. However, just like perhaps many of the research projects that we have, I do have to say that COVID has impacted this research project, but I do hope that we can have a conversation later about the possible research trajectories from this initial work that I have conducted. And I do hope that we can have some possible prospective future collaborations after this presentation. I think it is critical to start with the theoretical impulses that underpin this work. While I engage with several bodies of literature, I mainly focus on efforts to theorize urbanization beyond cities, particularly emphasizing the role of transnational mobilities. In theorizing island urbanization, I draw inspiration from the notion of dialectics of Barbadian poet Edward Kamal Brathwaite. Dialectics as a concept potentially frames the complex and shifting entanglements between sea and land, diaspora and indigeneity, and routes and roots. This approach and concept, I argue, can be a good methodological and metaphorical entry point to theorize island urbanization as waves and entanglements of relations that move beyond metropolitan-centric or diffusionist narratives of urbanization. I argue that at the heart of these urban transformations in these islands are these intimate geographies of gendered bodies and the interracial marriages that serve as key modes of urban accumulation and transnational mobilities. As such, I attend to feminist provocations in geography. I particularly attempt to uncover what geographer Isabel Dyke would call the hidden spaces of placemaking, as I try to examine the transnational and local interconnections of gender, sexuality, and urbanization in island communities. By focusing on the everyday, I attempt to capture the complexity of local and global relations in trying to conceptualize this accelerated pace of the stretching of social relations over space across islands and overseas. Also from these, I connect to the plethora of work that have already been done on marriage migration literature. Given that tourism is a key mode of urban transformation in these islands, I engage with existing tourism literature that has mainly focused on marketing these islands to the global market. Historically, the Philippine government has emphasized tourism as the way forward for these islands, particularly Central Philippines. As you can see on the slides, or in this particular slide, this slide shows an excerpt from an old document from the super regions plan of former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, where the plan was to group the islands of Central Philippines into the tourism super region, from which the task at hand was to create, quote, direct international access, seamless interconnectivity, world-class tourist facilities, unquote. Such political and economic desire to create the necessary infrastructure has provided the necessary conditions to facilitate urban transformation in these islands. So in the next few slides, I will present to you narratives of Filipinas and their partners, from which I try to attempt to weave a partial geography of island urbanization. I would like to say that this attempt is provisional, but I consider instructive. It's instructive to understanding the dynamics shaping island urbanization. I group these narratives into two common threads in my interviews. First is the suerte or luck, lucky with their spouses, and the sawing palad or the malas or being unlucky. These narratives are taken from various islands. So in the next few slides, we will sort of island hop as we foreground experiences of the Filipinas and their partners that I interviewed. So the first set of narratives pertain to those who were maswerte or lucky to have a good spouse. This brings us to John, a 60-plus-year-old retired Canadian from Saskatchewan. John, who met his Filipino wife more than 2 decades ago in a resort in the Visayas, considers his wife as the bedrock of their family and their business. His wife is Marissa, a 40-plus-year-old Filipina from Cebu province. Since foreigners cannot own property in the Philippines, Marissa was instrumental in the purchase of beach properties in a small coastal town in central Philippines. Through Marissa, John was able to finance and establish the town's first tourist resort, which mostly catered to foreign tourists and mixed-race couples from the US and Canada. Marissa has taken over most of the operations of the resort and has conducted most of the financial and legal transactions, oftentimes engaging with local politicians and landowners. In fact, during my last interview with Marissa, she was quite concerned about an incoming land dispute with another landowner in the town. Another Filipina experience is that of Maria, who considers herself being lucky to have a generous husband. Maria is a 40-plus-year-old Filipina who grew up in Bicol region and initially connected with her husband online. After getting married, they established one of the first resorts in an island in central Philippines, which is now considered to be one of the most highly rated resorts in the area, particularly through TripAdvisor, for those who are familiar with the website. So Maria was able to support her family through this business. She was able to support her family back in the province. She was able to finance the education of her siblings and also provide jobs to her relatives by employing them in the resort that they put up. In fact, they have also marketed the resort to foreigners for its supposedly attractive girls, most of whom are from the same village where Maria's from. So, based on these accounts of the maswerte couples, What emerges from these narratives is a particular geography connecting islands. This geography is constituted by flows of capital, care, investments, and relations. But what I would like to interrogate, given the time being, are two spaces. First is the tourist hub. Interracial marriages enable the flow of substantial capital as investments, funding the conversion of land into tourist resorts. Several of these resorts, due to the husband's nationality, have had a captive market, primarily tourists from the husband's home country. Thus, one can see country-specific themed resorts frequented by tourists from these countries. It is from these resorts where spaces of encounter take place between tourists and Filipinas who work or provide services to the resort. In the Philippines, foreigners cannot own land, and thus Filipinas would tend to become fronts in land purchases and other formal business transactions. And given the popularity of these tourist sites, they have instantiated a cumulative causation of investments through these interracial couples. They are also sites from which other interracial relationships are forged. So given the rise of these tourist hubs in recent years, I ask if this is reflected in the increasing patterns of Filipinos with foreign partners, where a significant sizable chunk are females. According to the Commission on Filipinos Overseas, 50% of these marriages are referrals through relatives or friends, while 24% are through the internet. This brings us to the hometown of Filipino wives. Through personal referrals and an emerging network, narratives of hometown transformation indicate the role of networking through interracial marriages. In one coastal town in one of the islands in the Visayas, the whole village was significantly transformed due to marriages with foreigners. These can be seen with the rise of concrete bungalows or two-story mansions and the emergence of businesses, several of which are internet cafes. Given this palpable impact of interracial marriages, internet cafes and other services have been put up to continue this lucrative relationship. Sadly, what has emerged is a sort of cottage industry in some parts that borders around issues on mail order brides and even online prostitution. Now let's go to the other narrative, the second narrative, the sawing palad. So in the narratives of the unfortunate, interracial relationships, while glorified for some, are also embedded in problematic power relations and historically embedded racialization of bodies and desires. In this particular narrative, I will share this failed relationship is grounded upon paranoia, which tends to underpin these kinds of engagement. This paranoia is tied to racialized stereotypes of bodies, the supposedly rich white man, and the submissive brown woman, or the Filipino gold digger. So let me take you to an island in central Philippines, which is one of the sort of promising tourist spots in the country. I met and got to know a couple, an American and Filipino couple, and I met and got to know them for a couple of months for like 6 years ago. Actually, no, 7 years ago. So the American guy, who is a former soldier, has traveled in various Asian countries and met his Filipino girlfriend in one of the tourist resorts. But our conversation has been fraught with paranoia about Filipinos and the Philippines and his fear of being a milking cow of his girlfriend's family. For him, he does not want to invest in the Philippines and honestly does not see his future with his girlfriend. His Filipino girlfriend, Anna, a 22-year-old who came to the island from northern Mindanao, is under immense pressure from all sides. She is the subject of verbal abuse from her boyfriend, who had become very stingy when it comes to money and demanded full disclosure of everything. So despite this, her family from Mindanao continues to pressure her regularly in sending money. She lived in with her boyfriend, but worked part-time in a store near the resort. Although she wants to have her own career and become a teacher, but because of all her pressure, she could not continue her education. On top of these, she has been catcalled several times by their neighbors and was even called a prostitute. So this presentation underscores the importance of looking at the role of gender, race, and sexuality in urbanization. And at the heart of urban transformations in these islands are these interracial marriages and gendered bodies, particularly female bodies, who become vessels of urban accumulation and social change. As I look into islands as sites of urbanization, it is of utmost importance to, as an urban scholar, to return to the theoretical drawing board and account for bodies, gender, and sexuality as important forces in analyzing urbanization. So I advocate for this in unison with recent calls by urban geographers Helga Leitner and Eric Shepard's call for a shifting ecosystem of critical urban theories in the current age. As such, I see the possibilities for comparison across contexts, or should I say, across tropical islands, working closely with similarities and differences, while being open to wider theoretical conversations across specificities. As such, I'm open to suggestions, clarifications, or thoughts about moving this project forward. I'm interested to see possible theoretical empirical trajectories that might emanate from these initial findings, and perhaps explore possible collaborations with several of you. So with that, I would like to thank the organizers and Professor. I also like to thank Professor Nicole Curato, is not here, but she invited me to speak, and Dr. Sandra Alde, and I thank everyone in the audience for taking the time to listen. Maraming salamat po.
Thanks very much, Andre, I knew it was going to be an amazing talk, so thanks very much. We'd now like to open up the floor for questions from the participants. So to kick things off, I might ask you first, Andre, what led you to the exploration of this question? It's a really interesting question. What led you to it? Was it by design, by accident? You stumbled on a stone on the street and how did it go?
Oh my gosh, it's quite personal because because of the research projects that I've been involved with, and because I've been interrogating the sort of the transnational dimensions of urbanization, and I've connected with a lot of expats. And at that time, I was in a relationship with a foreigner, and that kind of created this in-between space where I could not get out of this sort of these spaces in resorts where I would connect with the Filipino wives and their husbands, and I become sort of the middle person trying to interpret what's going on. So in these intimate spaces, I sort of put together this sort of research, and it became this organic research project that got bigger as time went by since 2012.
Thank you for being so generous with your answer, especially since it's very personal, and I think, yes, many of us are very much motivated by very personal things and very personal passions and experiences. So thanks for that.
I might have to add, this is a difficult project. I really have a hard time. I had a hard time having a lot of the conversations because I end up again in sort of interpreting the Filipino experience to the white husband, and then having to visit blog spots and expat websites. It's full of stereotypes.
Yeah.
And as a Filipino, it hurts my heart, and so just reading through.
yes, I can completely understand that it does get, it can get very uncomfortable, to say the least, at times. So thank you again for your generosity. We've got questions on the Q&A, so please put your questions onto the Q&A. And let's kick things off with a question from Lady Lynn Mangada. Did you see any pattern emerging from the Visayas versus Mindanao accounts? It's an interesting question. Are there any cultural differences, etc.?
That's a good question. I would say that because of the limited interviews I've had, so I sort of hop from one island to another. So I wouldn't say that there is a distinct pattern. What I would say is that what happens is that in these resorts, a lot of the Filipino wives I interviewed are actually migrants from other islands.
Yes.
Then they moved to these resorts because it's a tourist site and it's a site where they can accumulate. Yeah. So I did not see like difference in between Visayas and Mindanao, and perhaps that's something worthwhile to pursue later on. But that's a very important, valid question.
Yes, and to consider, to add yet another variable on top of your many other variables, the impact of internal migration within the countries. That's a really important question. All right,
and
thanks very much.
Ethnicity, the notion of ethnicity, like if you're like in some of the islands, there's a coastal town that is sort of part of southern Tagalog. So there's a pejorative notion, like there's an image of among these, like there's an image assigned to Visayan migrants.
Yes.
So there are these narratives that are carried over in terms
of what a complex, complex web of variables. And I think you've got your work cut out for you, Andre, for the next like 10 years or so. All right, we've got another question from Irene Andal. Thanks, Andre, for the very interesting talk. I'm wondering if there's a case among your respondents caught in between being suerte and malas. How did the Filipinas see their own experiences with their foreign husbands? What a great question, Irene, like a spectrum.
Definitely, that's a very good question. And, I mean, the dichotomy I made is selective because there are other narratives where it's mixed. So even in how they interpret their situations, like, okay, I don't get to spend a lot of time with let's say with my family back in the province, and yet you have economic power. So there are cases wherein there's a sense of capital, like financial freedom and access to money, but they're also caught as women. They have to be the mother as well, and then they have to support their family back home. So they're also resort managers and handling things. So still the same set of pressures on women, having to handle their career as the resort manager, and then you have to be the mom and the daughter for your family back in the province.
Yes, that's an amazing question. Thanks so much for that question, Irene. The spectrum between suerte and malas, I think, is a great area to interrogate further. Okay, we've got a question from Erica Carrion. Speaking of stereotypes, were you able to see a pattern in the kind of white man that would pursue such relationships and see in them a business venture? Do they always enter into these relationships with a land ownership or business in mind? This is an interesting question too. Thanks for that, Erica.
It's not always. Based on my accounts, well, basically the interviews I made are those who were interested or who were engaged in land transactions, except for the malas, because he was not interested because of his relationship with the girlfriend.
Yeah.
but based on the message boards, it's mixed because there are those who are warning. There are those who are warning prospective visitors or prospective retirees to, purchase land,
Yeah.
use their wives,
Yes.
because the wife can just use them and then just turn
Yes.
their backs ahead against them, and then they have, it's in their name that they have their the land. So
Yeah.
it's mixed, I would say.
Yes. So the diversity among the expats and the foreigners who are interested in marrying, I suppose, the Filipinas would also be great. There's a related question here from Zilun Huang. Thank you for this exciting topic to examine island urbanisms. My question is, Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans who study language centers go to Cebu or other islands to have a relationship. How does this fit into your concept of your model of island urbanism? What an excellent question, Zealand.
It is an excellent question. I mean, all these questions they open up all these other strands of research that need to be done. Because most of the interviews that I made were mostly Caucasian, Filipino partners, and that has a different dynamic. As opposed to East Asian migration, or at least movement to the Philippines, that would have a different set of dynamics. So that definitely warrants further examination. But I would say also that I wish I'm in the Philippines so I could look into the wave of Chinese tourists coming to the Philippines and its impact in terms of, relationships with local Filipinas, and also the ways in which the retirement visa has reconfigured the flows of retirees from different countries. So
Yes,
yeah,
that's
sorry, I don't have a direct answer to that, but that is a very important topic that is connected to this.
Yes, and related to the question of Erica on the stereotypical white man, and Zealand's question on the other, ethnicities that come to the Philippines, we have yet another related question from Dakila Yi from UP Tacloban. This is a great talk, and I see these transformations that you talk about, especially in a surfing town in Eastern Samar. I wonder, what are the motivations from the end of the foreign spouses? So this is related to Erica's question on stereotypes and Zealand's question on motivations to learn language. Does this tie with the literature on critical ecotourism, where they see the Philippines as an exotic adventure space for extraction? Wow, amazing question. Thank you for that, Becky.
So I need to look into that literature on the what's that literature again?
Critical ecotourism.
Critical ecotourism. That's something to look into. But the question on the motivation among wives, I would say that it's diverse, and we can never say that it's purely solely for economic reasons, right? I mean, it's complicated. There are those who are really it's when you talk about love is and relationship, they're so embedded in multiple axes of capital, and also finding the desire to build a family as well. But there are narratives, for example, of what we call as, so in one of my interviews, there's this notion of island girls. And for those who are familiar with beach spaces, I don't like the beaches, by the way, but I have to. But in these beach resorts, there's this. So some of the conversations I've had pertain to the concept of island girls. Like they explicitly go to these resorts so that they can find. Some of them are prostitutes, while some of them are really targeting foreigners as a mechanism to better their lives. As so,
Yeah.
but I would say it's I mean it's a mix, but there are these multiple motivations.
So the diversity is apparent not just on the side of the foreigners, but also on the side of the Filipinas who are seeking to marry these foreigners. So again, even more stuff to research, Andre. We've got a clarificatory question from Stephen Rood. When you spoke of the narrative of hometown transformation, is it the transformed site where the urbanist tourism resort is, or the hometown of a Filipina who is now in another place? Amazing question, Stephen. Thank you for that.
Thanks for that. Yes, that is a good clarificatory question. What I presented is the transformation of the hometown, the home villages of some of these wives, because because word of mouth, because of word of mouth and the ways in which that the interracial marriages have really transformed the life of the wife and the family, and then through networks and referrals, the hometown, the village is transformed as well, as along with the tourist sites. So the tourist sites are mainly transformed because of the fact that they are attractive to tourists, and they have they are pretty and nice. They have nice beaches, but the hometowns are not particularly touristy, but they are transformed because of the fact that a lot of the families from there have been engaged in these relationships that have transformed their lives.
Thanks for that clarification, Andre. A related question, which you didn't, which wasn't really part of your talk, but I was interested to hear what you had, if you saw any patterns in the data where the diversity of, let's say, the Filipinas, or the diversity of the foreigners lead to different types of urbanisms. So for example, if the motivation is, let's say, motivation A, does that typically lead to resort development, or does it, are there other cases where economic empowerment, for example, takes a different form, like opening up a store or a grocery store in the hometown, just as an example? Do different motivations lead to different types of urbanisms?
Oh, that's a good question. It's something that that I haven't really reflected on, simply because I was so focused on the transformation of the place, as opposed to like teasing out the different motivations and how it's impacting the emergent geographies out of that. But
Yes.
again, that's something to think about. I'm trying to think about some of like some narratives from my stories, as I'll go back to that once I remember something.
We shall come back to it, Andrew. In the meantime, Lady Lynn has asked another question. Islands are beautiful places to go, but not necessarily a safe haven for retirement. Did you ask foreigners about disaster risk exposure? Do they have contributions to island resilience? Oh, what a really great question, Lady. Thank you for that.
Oh my gosh. Well, this video will be recorded, so we will remember all these things, and we can put up a research group on islands. One of the, like some of the resorts, actually, when I interviewed some of the couples in an island near Luzon, they are actually, they're sort of trying to tap into their transnational networks in advocating for sustainable development. either they're using it as a means to bring in more tourists, as they say, we're doing sustainable tourism, and we're working hard to make sure that we are part of the part of the campaign for sustainable development and resilience and so on and so forth, given the fact that the Philippines has been impacted by a lot of natural disasters. So some of the narratives of these couples in their resorts some of these narratives allude to their efforts in advocating for campaigns, and sort of some of them would reach out to the local government and say that we're doing something.
Yeah.
But that's a very good
it's a great question. Thanks again, Lady Lynn. And is there a generational angle to this one, Andre? Yes. Because they do have children, and if you have a retiree and let's say a younger Filipina, do the children then stay to manage the resort, or do the children then migrate to the country of the dad? How does it go?
It's mixed as well. Like there are those who decided to stay in the beach and pursue or be part of the business empire in one way or another. But I guess most of the couples that I interviewed, particularly those in their early 40s, their children are still kids, so they're living with them.
So growing up in the resort.
In the resort, but some of the older ones, some of them would go to their father's home country to study, and then they would go to the resort during summer vacation. Like there was one time I went to this resort, and the teenage kids were there, and they brought their schoolmates to the resort.
Yeah, wow, that's even more visitors to the islands. That's really interesting. All right, so you have yet another angle to your research, Andre, the generational angle.
Yes,
and we got
even with the retirees,
yeah.
retirees. So there are also so what the Philippine government did was they lowered down the age. The minimum age for those who can retire in the Philippines, it's 35 years old.
Oh wow! Oh,
so I'm definitely.
Are we retiring now, Andre?
So if you're at least 35 years old, you can now retire to the Philippines.
You can now retire.
And just put $20,000 in a bank account in the Philippines, and
Yes. Oh wow! All right. Well, I think the theme of the questions today has been all about spectrums, and we have another related question, another question related to spectrums from Erica Carrion, who wants to comment on something you said earlier about how interesting it was to use in-betweenness as a way of describing the island resort as a space that facilitates these connections. So as well as how these women are caught between being perceived as island girls, but at the same time, as attested what you said about 50% of these marriage connections being referrals, that this is also undeniably a way you achieve upward mobility. So perhaps this quality of liminality becomes synonymous or a defining quality of islandness. Oh. So question, Erica. Thank you. Wonderful.
Thanks, Erica. That's a very insightful conceptual reflection on these accounts.
Any comments on that, Andre? And I'd like to invite any more questions. We're coming really close to the end. So I might ask, Andre, what's next for you in this massive research agenda? What's the next question?
Well, those questions that were raised, but I mean, to be honest, I've been quite disappointed with the fact that I could not leave Syracuse. It's been, sorry, now now going to talk about COVID and its impact on research. I was able to follow up on some of the interviews through Zoom, but again, it's just difficult to conduct research. I really love to be on site because nothing beats being in the field, right?
This is so
Um,
true.
so it's
Immersing yourself in the whole environment, and yeah, well,
yeah,
hopefully we're all going to get out of lockdown soon, and we are all able to travel again soon. So and I really do hope we're able to travel soon, Andre, because I really can't wait for the next chapter of your research. It's an amazing and really interesting and fascinating area of study, and I must thank you for pursuing thank you for pursuing this really interesting area. All
and for
right.
those who'd like to collaborate with me, I would like to take this opportunity. Please, you know, email me, message me. I am really interested to I've been interested in a lot of things around urban issues, but I think this trajectory is such a fascinating project to think about and also sort of link with other issues as well.
Yes, and on the topic, so we do look forward to your next interesting chapter, Andre, and we do invite collaborations from those of you who are interested. Get in touch with Andre. As this discussion today has shown us, there's a massive research agenda out there, so the more hands make light work. And on the subject of really interesting stuff, we'd like to invite everyone here to our next another interesting seminar in our web series. We've got YouTube and Philippine politics by Professor Cheryl Soriano. Oh, I'm totally going to attend this too, Andre. YouTube
Yeah,
and
I will
Philippine
attend that too.
politics. And it's,
Wow.
oh my goodness, it's 4 a.m. your time, Andre. So we shall,
I will wake up to this. I
it'll
will
be a
wake up
struggle.
early.
Yes, but we're all going to attend. And thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, of course, to Andre, and we hope to see you all again at our future sessions. Thank you. Have a good day. Have a good night.